Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and talk about none other than the iPhone XR and see how this iPhone is going to hold up in 2023. Now, the one thing I will definitely tell you is this iPhone has came and went. It's had a very interesting, past. And looking at the future, I think this iPhone is probably only going to be getting better and better with at least some of the things Apple has been doing within iOS 15 and iOS 16. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the first thing I'll definitely tell you is the XR, very good iPhone still for the most part. You can't really go wrong if you still keep it. But if you're planning on upgrading, I mean, there are some other iPhones I would probably recommend this year too. So links will be down in the description if you want to pick up some iPhones I would recommend. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this iPhone actually came out back in 2018. And so it's going to be approaching, quite a few years. I mean, 5 years this iPhone is going to be actually getting this year. And I'll say this is still a pretty good iPhone overall. I think there may be other iPhones I would recommend, but I think for this iPhone being a 5-year-old device and it not even being the main flagship of that year, I think Apple did a decent job. Funny enough though, if you look at videos I made back in 2018, I was kind of, reluctant of this iPhone. I wasn't the biggest fan. And the main reason for that was because of the downgrade of some areas of this iPhone from the iPhone X. It had an IPS panel, and I'll say it still doesn't look that bad. I think Apple was reaching a different demographic with this iPhone than at least the one I was in at that moment. But I do think over time, this iPhone has really matured into a really good priced budget iPhone for the most part. So with that 6.1-inch IPS panel on the front, it still looks pretty good. Obviously it's not an OLED display like we have on the iPhone X, but I think Apple did a good job at that moment. And I do think over time, it's actually gotten pretty good. I think it's not a bad panel at all. It's definitely not its main feature or something I would brag about, but it's not a bad thing either. You have Face ID on this iPhone too, which is a really nice touch. And you have the lightning port at the bottom, which is great. And on the back, you have that standard glass back. So no frosted glass back or anything, but I still think this iPhone feels very premium. It does not feel like a cheap iPhone. It seems there's a few things with it. It's kind of like a thicker iPhone when you kind of consider the iPhones that we have nowadays. It also has a little bit of a thicker amount of bezel on it when compared to even an iPhone 12 with the flat sides. But I'll say, for this iPhone, whenever I've compared it to the iPhone 11, 12, 13, and 14s throughout the last 5 years, I think this iPhone has held up very well in the body standpoint. And even when I compared it to the iPhone 14s, you would not believe how, good of an iPhone this thing still feels like. It still feels like a very premium phone. So from that standpoint, I think that's a pretty big thing. You also have that single camera setup on the back, wireless charging on this phone, IP certification, and overall, for an iPhone that probably costs less than $200 on eBay right now, and that is a pretty good price for a phone like this. If you're wanting to go and buy the most expensive iPhone 14 Pro, then clearly that is going to be a better iPhone for sure. But I do think at this moment, Apple did a pretty good job, and it's held up pretty well throughout the last few years. Now, in that camera department, we're getting obviously that single 12 megapixel wide angle lens, and honestly, it's not a bad camera. You're also getting a 7 megapixel front facing camera that can shoot 1080p at 60 frames per second. Now, this is the thing I will definitely tell you about this camera setup, is that for one, just to get the bad out of the way, the problem is that it is a single camera setup. And in phones nowadays, even on a lot of budget phones like a Pixel 6a, those phones are getting basically multiple cameras. Even the iPhone 14s, Apple doesn't do this single camera setup thing anymore unless it's for their iPhone SE. And everyone knows the iPhone SE really isn't that great of an iPhone anymore either. So with the iPhone XR, that single camera setup definitely isn't doing it any favors, but I do think it's not a bad camera for that single camera. I just did another camera comparison between this phone and iPhone X and iPhone 14, and this camera really wasn't even that bad. The main downsides of this camera though are the lack of ultra wide sensor, no telephoto lens either. Those are pretty big things nowadays. The lack of any extra modes like cinematic mode. You do get portrait mode, but you don't get any stabilization modes or anything like that. And no 4K at 60 on the front can also be a downside. But overall, I'll probably say for the most part, still not a bad camera. And I think overall, if you know what you're getting into, it's definitely not going to be surprising of how, it's going to be a good camera for the most part. So that kind of covers it up there. Now in the software and the longevity portion of this phone, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated for the most part. So the issue that we kind of have at hand for this product is that we are still going to be supported with software for the next few years. I don't know if this iPhone is going to last, 2 or 3 years more from where we're at now, but I know it's going to be supported for the remainder of this year of 2023, and I would probably say it's going to be supported all of next year as well. So it's just one of those things we're just going to have to wait and see. I think this iPhone is still, like I said, going to be here for this whole entire year, and as well as 2024 probably as well. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But another interesting thing that Apple kind of pushed out recently, or that a lot of leakers have been saying, is that Apple could actually end up making the next generation iPhone SE, which is their, smaller budget iPhone, in this same body. So they could actually be recycling and kind of reincarnating the iPhone XR and putting it in that iPhone SE as their new budget iPhone. So I think that is going to be something that's going to be very interesting as well, and kind of making the iPhone XR, I guess the legacy of this iPhone, last a little bit longer. So it's another one of those things we're going to have to wait and see, but I'm going to be very curious to see what happens with that iPhone in the future. Now, another thing in the performance segment, and this is a very interesting thing. So this iPhone has that Apple A12 Bionic chip inside with 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, to give you some perspective, I've used the iPhone XR like crazy. I've compared it against basically not only every single iPhone that has come out after this iPhone, but also almost every single flagship phone in general, including the Galaxies, including the Google Pixels, probably some other phones here and there. The Nothing phone I compared it to as well. And I think the iPhone XR holds its own. I think it does a great job for a majority of things that is basically, going on. Again, if you're trying to compare it, apples to apples, it's going to get beaten by the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 11. But because this iPhone, Apple did a decent job at that moment, it has a fairly low resolution display, so it has less pixels to push. I think this iPhone still holds up kind of well in the performance segment. If you're playing heavy intensive games like Genshin Impact or Call of Duty Mobile, you can go ahead and rest assured that those games are probably going to run perfectly fine. It's definitely going to overheat the phone, and the battery life may not be as good as a 14 Pro for that matter. But the big thing to keep in mind is that if, the game is just lagging and it's just being a super slow game, you have to keep in mind that with most games nowadays, you have the ability of lowering down the graphic profile. So you can pretty much do that within this iPhone as well with those games. So if a game doesn't run well, just lower the graphics. Yeah, it kind of sucks a little bit, but you have that ability there. So you have a little bit more tailoring for your iPhone that you can kind of mess with. So I think that's a pretty big thing too. So from the performance segment, I think it's still a very good performing iPhone for the most part. To end it off with the battery life though, I think the battery life of this iPhone when it first came out was pretty good. I think since then, phones like the iPhone 12s and 14 Pros and whatnot have done a really good job with their battery life. And I think they've done, at the end of the day, I think a better job with those iPhones than how the iPhone XR was at launch, which is expected. You want your iPhones to be better. So that's kind of how I see that iPhone in the battery life segment as well. And to kind of sum up this whole entire video, I think the iPhone XR is a very good iPhone for this year. I think it is probably one of the cheapest iPhones I would recommend buying. I wouldn't really recommend going like super below this, but I think the XR does a really good job. It's very cheap. It's basically available all over the place. And also, it's still a pretty good functional iPhone that's going to be supported probably for the next few years. So that's definitely how I feel about the iPhone XR. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.